A reading from the book of Exodus, chapter 20, verses 1 through 2 and 15, and from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 6, verses 19 through 24. And God spoke all these words: I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall not steal. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourself treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will also be. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. The word of the Lord.
Thanks, Aaron. If you've been with us, we've been looking at the Ten Commandments, and hopefully you've been able to see that God has a lot to say about what our lives are meant to look like. Right? Again, in our world today, we're desperate for guidance and direction, and so we're kind of going back to, well, what is it? What's the moral fabric of the universe that God is saying? This is how you are meant to live in order to most flourish. This is the guidelines for your life that help you to practically manage a kind of life that God has always intended for you to be truly human. And hopefully you've been able to see that we've been getting really practical and very personal over the past couple of weeks. Right? We've been digging into your relationship with your parents, right? Which is sort of we're talking about parents. Or we've been talking about your relationship with work. Last week, of course, we talked about sex and your relationship life. And today we're going to talk about one of those other key areas of our lives that we tend to hold very central to our lives as an individual private thing. We're going to be talking about money, your possessions, as well as your view of wealth. One person said, if you really want to know what any single culture really believes or what it's really animated by, you just have to look at two things: the way that they date and the way that people spend their money. Those are the two most powerful things that have always been trying to replace God for ages. And that's why last week, again, we talked about sex and dating, and now this week we're talking about money. And it comes from the 8th commandment that we just had read of do not steal. Right? But like every other commandment, like we've been talking about, the prohibition that God is giving, do not, is also met with a positive vision for the way that God intends you to live your life. And so when he says do not steal, the positive vision that he's principally addressing is our relationship and our attitude toward our possessions and our money and wealth. Now, I get it. Money is not something that we typically want to talk about, especially at church, right? We view it as a very private matter, as private as our dating lives or our relationship lives or our sexual lives might be. But I want us to see this, that the Bible actually talks a lot about money. In fact, there are over 2,300 verses throughout the entire Bible that deal with some kind of principle related to money. And so it's as if God's word is saying to us, we need to be talking more about these things. I know it feels uncomfortable and you don't want to talk about it, but unless you actually deal with our heart and our attitudes toward money, you'll never be free. And that's what Jesus gets at in our passage in Matthew. Jesus says we need to talk about this because money is a powerful rival god that promises to give you things that only God can really give you. We look to money and wealth for hope, for comfort, for peace, for security, for joy, for happiness. It is a powerful rival god that promises these kinds of things, that therefore has the power to grip your entire personality and cause you to have a complete devotion toward it. So Jesus says we've got to talk about it because unless you are keenly aware of the power that money can have over you, you will be malformed to be less and less human, less and less living the life that God has always intended for. But if you do know and understand what God is calling you to and the relationship and attitude we're meant to have with money, then instead of it using you, you can start to use it to flourish and to help others flourish, to help this world to flourish. And so today I want to look at 3 different attitudes that we can have toward our wealth and our possessions that are typically, that we live into. And the first attitude that we're going to look at is the attitude that yours is mine, whatever is yours is mine, so I'll take it. And then we'll look at the attitude of, well, mine is mine, and so I'll keep it. And then finally, we'll look at the attitude of, mine is God's, and so I'll give it. Let's look at how we take, how we keep, and how we can give. So first, the attitude of what's yours is mine and I'll take it. Now that's principally the attitude that the 8th commandment is trying to address, right? Do not steal. And of course, we all know that stealing is wrong. We all know that stealing is taking something that does not belong to you, you are not entitled to, and yet you're taking it for yourself. And this kind of stealing can be motivated by 2 different heart postures that move against the purposes of God. That's why it is wrong. Right? The first mentality that can cause us to steal, take from folks, is through a power mentality. It's because I can, and so I will. So some of the most prominent forms of stealing in our world today is through extortion or oppression. Right? That's using power in order to get something that is not yours to take. And God explicitly forbids this kind of stealing because he reminds Israel, this is what you are saved from. Remember when you were once slaves in Egypt and you were the oppressed? Where Egypt and Pharaoh lived into a power dynamic that said, I can oppress you and take from you because I can, because I'm more powerful than you. And so throughout the entire Bible, not just in Israel's history, the entire Bible, there's this key theme that we are never to use our power to relate to other people strictly through power with a mentality that says yours is mine or it can be mine and I can take it. That we can take whatever we want from those who are weaker. And instead, Israel was told to always care for the poor, the lonely, the weak in the midst of your people, the foreigner, the widow, the orphan. Not to take advantage of people like that, because that was the very mentality that you were saved from. And so God says, don't become Egypt as you're now living into freedom. Don't use power to take. But there's also another mentality that we can often have, and that's through a scarcity mentality, not a power mentality, but a scarcity mentality that's motivated to steal because of our fear. It's this idea that I'm sure a lot of us have experienced within us that says, I don't think there's going to be enough for me. And so I've got to do whatever I can to make sure that I'm going to be okay. All right, we usually think of this kind of stealing as petty theft or stealing for food, right? But it's God basically saying is, this is you essentially still living out of your slave mentality as if you were still in Egypt, that nobody cares for you or will provide for you, and so you have to take matters into your own hands. And again, we probably think that this kind of stealing is sort of this physical petty theft. But for us here in New York City, this scarcity mentality and kind of stealing can often come out in our workplaces, where we live into a scarcity mentality. There's not enough credit to go around, so what am I going to do to make sure that I'm seen at work, to make sure that I'm valued at work? And sometimes we can do that. Some of us might be tempted to steal credit or withhold praise from somebody. Or some of us might shift the blame and say it's their fault and not mine. And a lot of times we can be stealing the reputation of other people by trying to withhold praise or give subtle digs at work, right? Paint somebody in a kind of light that makes you look better and makes you feel better. Or sometimes because we're so desperate in this scarcity mentality, we're often trying to steal the praises of our bosses to make us feel better. Right, so this scarcity mentality is rampant in our city today. And when we do, right, it's not just physical stealing. When we do, we're living into an attitude that has very little regard for other people. And it's a heart that says, you exist for my benefit. Right, that's this attitude of what's yours is mine, and so I'll take it. But the most prevalent view that I think here in our modern Western world today is not necessarily that. It is much more the second attitude that we're going to talk much more longer about, which is what's mine is mine, and so I'll keep it. Because that feels really natural, doesn't it? Right? The view that we tend to have today is that that's not a criminal way to live, of course. I'm not taking from anybody. All I'm doing is saying, this is what I've accumulated. This is what I've done. And so therefore, I should have complete ownership and a complete right to do with it however I wish. What's mine is mine, and so I will keep it. Of course, that feels natural and standard to us today. But Jesus in our passage in Matthew, which is one of the most prevalent passages that Jesus talks about money and wealth, in our passage, Jesus is explicitly warning us about this particular attitude that feels so natural and normal to us. Because he's saying that the reason we feel so tempted to keep it is because there is this alluring nature and power behind money that can spiritually blind us and move us further and further away from God. And so in Matthew 6, he says, you cannot serve both God and money. Now, in the Aramaic, the word that's used there for money is the word mammon. Maybe you've heard that before. But this is Jesus personifying, deifying money, not just the literal word money, but he's deifying it to show that there is this active rival power that is behind money and wealth in our world. Now, before I get into what that means, let me just start off right off the bat by saying this. Money and wealth is not inherently evil. We're meant to have it. In fact, it's actually God's idea. So back in Genesis 1, God gives the cultural mandate that's essentially to say, I want you to create value from the creation that I've given to you. And so wealth creation is something that God intends for us to do and to have, to cultivate. That's what it means. But wealth, therefore, and wealth creation was always, from the beginning, meant to enhance our relationship with God and one another. It was meant to be a tool that we use to bless the rest of creation. Right? So it's a good thing. It's not an inherently evil thing to have it. But here's the thing that we've got to see. That if we are not equally keenly aware of the power that it can have over us, if we are not keenly aware of the power that it can have over us, it will end up using you rather than you using it. Mammon has the power to turn you into an economic principle rather than into the image of God. That's the kind of power that there is behind it. Here's what Richard Foster says. He says, behind money are very real spiritual forces that energize it and give it a life of its own. Hence, money is an active agent. It is a law unto itself, and it is capable of inspiring devotion. I know that many of us, if not all of us, have felt this. The powerfully addictive nature of money. Right? When you were a kid, you're like, oh my gosh, $1,000 is so much money. I wish I had $1,000. And you get a little bit older, you're like, no, like $10,000, dude. $10,000 is nothing. And then the older you get, you're like, all right, taxes, living costs, $15 cocktails. I need at least $1 million or so to really feel comfortable just to get by. And then you get older and you're like, yo, I need like $1 billion actually. Because the more that we get, the more that we need, because we tend to normalize excess. And here's what money can do. It feeds on our heart's desires to be happy, to be safe, to be comfortable, to be popular, to be worthy. And so mammon is whispering to our hearts, just trust me. Once you get this, then you will be okay. Once you have that much saved, then you will finally be okay. If you earn this and get that title and that much amount saved in your bank account, then finally you will be okay. And of course, the insidious part of that is that okay, that sense of being truly okay never comes. And we're never content. It doesn't deliver on its promises. And here's proof of that. Here's what Jonathan Haidt says, who's a professor at NYU who studies psychology. He says, wealth itself has only a very small direct effect on happiness because it is so effective at speeding up the hedonic treadmill. And later on in the book that he writes about this, he quotes this World Happiness Report that says that our per capita income has more than doubled since 1972, right? So we are on average making double what people are making back in 1972. And yet, our sense of happiness is unchanged, or it's slightly even declined from his studies. That means the more that we get, it's not adding to a direct relation or correlation of happiness. And you might be thinking here right now, not me, Lord, test me. You can test me on that. Give me a little bit more. Let's see, because I think I'm the exception. Right, we all think that if we had a little bit more that we actually will be happy, but we've got to realize us living here in New York City, in America, in the West in 2025, we are absolutely addicted to wealth and consumerism. And this idea that if we can just get a little bit more, spend a little bit more, have a little bit more, then I will finally be happy. And you know what that kind of language is? That's addiction language. Right? Neuroscience and research has shown literally the same parts of your brain light up when you think about money or when you receive wealth, the same feedback loops and the same kind of dopamine hit as if you are a drug addict. Right? That has been that's been studied, and it's definitely been shown all throughout the research. And therefore, you need more and more in order to have the same dopamine hit that wealth can give you, just like drugs or just like anything else that can lead to an addiction cycle. You know, there was this really interesting article several years ago that I read in the New York Times called For the Love of Money, and it chronicled sort of this young guy who was working on Wall Street for the first time who was so thankful for like a $10,000 bonus when he was 22, and he started to kill it, you know, as some people can do in the city, and by the time he was like 26, he was making millions and millions of dollars in bonuses. And he chronicles how at one point he got like a $15 or $10 million bonus, and he was so upset. He was so upset because it was not what he had thought he was going to get. When just 4 years ago, he would have been thrilled at $10,000. Right, this is addiction language. This is the thing that money can do to us. And the worst part about that is that when we are in these kinds of addiction cycles to wealth, we will never, ever be generous. We'll never be generous. Because you always feel like there's never enough. And one of the greatest lies that we tell ourselves is, if I just had a little bit more, then I would give. Then I would be generous. I remember speaking to a large donor a couple of years ago who said, you are kidding yourself if you think you're more generous the more money that you have, because it only gets harder to write checks the more zeros there are on the end of it. It never gets easier. And the reason for that is because when we are addicted to wealth, it means we absolutely live in a scarcity mentality, which is why we never feel like we have enough to give. But here's the other thing that Jesus says. It's not just the addictive nature of it that can blind you. He says there is this spiritual danger that's happening that can blind you even to yourself, that can start to deform your moral character. All right, here's what he says in verse 22 of Matthew chapter 6. He says, the eye is a lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if it's not, it will be full of darkness. Right? It's like, why are you talking about that when you're talking about mammon, Jesus? And he's getting at this idea that there is this blinding nature of money that has the power to fill your entire body with darkness, which means you can start to see yourself in all the wrong ways. Tim Keller said this that I thought was such a good example. He says, when you are the world's leading expert in like almost anything else, if you're the world leading expert in physics or you're the world leading like violin player, you never look at every other area of your life to think that you know something about those areas too, right? Like your knowledge is limited to your area of specialty. But he says there's something funny about money. When you make a lot of money, when you have a lot of wealth, you all of a sudden start to think that you know about everything else. Have you met people like that? They start to overtrust their intuitions and their knowledge because they start to think, well, look at what I've done. Of course I have great intuitions about everything else. And so it can start to lead you to see yourself and overtrust yourself, and you start to think that you can understand everything, which means you are becoming blind to even yourself. Because here's the thing. Wealth is not only has the power to become a rival God, but wealth has the power to turn you into a rival God. Look at what I've done. Look at what I've created. Look at the power that I have. And that leads not only, of course, to pride, but that leads you inevitably to see, I don't really need God in my life. Why? I've got all the hope, the comfort, security that I need. I can make it myself. And that's why Jesus is bringing that blindness to the light by telling us this in Matthew chapter 6. And I think even now, even now, it's easy for us to feel like, well, this isn't really true of me. I don't think I really have this problem. And that is the blindness of the power of mammon working directly in us right now, because we always look at somebody else, especially in this city, that's way more extravagant or that you're more generous than somebody else. And so we start to think that we're okay. But Jesus doesn't let us off the hook by that. He says this. He says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And so he's basically saying, do you want hard proof as to our addiction to ourselves and to our money, of how much we have tied ourselves to our wealth and our money? He's basically saying, follow the data. See how much it is that you spend on yourself. Look at your bank account to think about what you most value, where your money most easily flows to. That tells you all that you need to know. And there's been a lot of research that's been done about giving, particularly amongst Christians in the church. And Christians give 2.5% of their income away on a national average, which already sounds crazy. But what's crazier is that that number is down from 3.3% during the Great Depression. So we have more than ever. We're more affluent than ever, and yet we all feel like we can't give more. Why is that? That is the power of mammon. That is the blinding nature that wealth can cause in us. And so we start to think that this attitude of what's mine is natural, and that's okay, and that's the way of the world. But Jesus is very explicitly saying there is a very big spiritual danger here, my friends. This is a spiritually dangerous place to be if you're blind to your relationship with wealth. That is why Jesus is so concerned with this idea, why the Bible talks about it so much. Because at the end of the day, Jesus doesn't want your money. Please, friends, let me just say that right off the bat. Jesus does not want your money. He is after your heart. It is your heart that is at stake, which is why he says you cannot serve both God and money. He's saying your heart, the thing that you worship, the person that you are becoming, the central navigating system of your entire life, that is the thing that is at stake. That is the thing that I want to save. This is made clear throughout the scriptures, right? Jesus doesn't praise the people who give the most money. He praises those who are giving out of a heart, out of a posture of worship and devotion to him over the rival god Mammon. So please don't think that this is a material issue. But Jesus is saying this is a deeply spiritual issue, which is why we need to learn to adopt this third attitude, which is what's mine is God's. Therefore, I will be generous with it. What is mine is God's. I will be generous with it. Throughout the Bible, the view that the Bible teaches is that everything, all of our resources, all come from him. That we are principally not owners, but we are principally stewards. The story of Israel makes this clear, right? Remember, the Israelites were slaves who had nothing to their name. And God saves them and he promises to take them to the land of Canaan, the land flowing with milk and honey. And so he's saying, I'm going to give you this land for your inheritance. And you're going to make money off of this land. You're going to flourish in this land. But remember, this is a land that I gave to you. Everything that you have is a gift from me, and therefore our principal posture is meant to be a steward of the gifts that God has given to us. And we're meant to steward that by cultivating the way of generosity, giving ourselves away. Because very simply, friends, the way that you break the power of mammon in your life, it's so simple. It's so simple. It's to give it away. To use it, not be used by it, but to use it for the sake of others, for the building up of God's kingdom that will never fade or moth or vermin will destroy. To bless creation, to be about his glory and what he is doing in this world. To give your lives to that, to give your resources to that. Here's what Richard Foster says. He says this: when we give money, we are releasing a little more of our egocentric selves and a little more of our false security. That is why it hurts so much to give. That is why it's not that easy for us to give. But that is the very thing that Jesus ultimately wants. Again, he's after our hearts. And you got to see this 8th commandment of do not steal is meant to work in tandem with another Old Testament law, the tithing law, which Israel was not only called not to steal from others, but now to cultivate a sense of generosity. God also commands the tithe to say, give 10% of whatever you earn from this land back to what his purposes are. And he's giving that in order to free Israel from their slavery mentality, from their devotion to other gods. And so Israel is now being commanded by God into the way of generosity so that they might now be spiritually formed under Yahweh to be his people, which of course they didn't know how to be God's people. They didn't know how to be generous. Because remember, for 400 years, Israel endured slavery under Egypt. And do you know what that will do to a person? It will create a scarcity mentality that goes deep into their hearts, that is always questioning, am I going to be okay? Am I enough? Does somebody love me? Who's going to provide for me? And so to deal with that, God in Deuteronomy 14, he requires Israel, this is so crazy, he requires Israel to tithe, to set aside 10% of all that they produce in the land, to offer that back to the Lord, always as an act of worship, as an act of devotion, as a way of saying, Jesus, God, I trust you and nothing else. And that 10% was significant because it was sort of the first offerings of it. The first 10% was meant to represent the rest of the 90%, to say, not only is this what I'm giving to you, but everything is yours, God. And in your generosity, you're letting me keep that. But the first 10% is representative of the remaining 90%. And every time that Israel tithed, it was a reminder and a recognition that their entire lives were not only owed to the God who saved them, but could be trusted in the hands of Yahweh who provided for them. He's saying, I'm the one who's authored your salvation. I'm the one that you need to look to for all that you are wanting, for hope, peace, security, comfort, joy, everything. That's meant to come from me. And so he commands it in order to make this a spiritual discipline in the lives of Israel. It was meant to be built into the rhythm of their lives to deal with their worrying hearts, of asking, am I secure? Am I okay? Does somebody love me? Am I going to be okay? And God says, you're going to be spiritually formed to trust me by giving things away, by giving away what God has first provided for you, so that you can grow in your trust in the Creator and not in the created things themselves. And God makes it into a law, not only not to steal, but to give. Because the people who are formed through slavery, who had this slavery mindset, this scarcity mindset for generations, would never just naturally become givers. It was always going to have to come through practice, by learning how to give, to live truly generously, which means this was a necessary spiritual discipline. Again, it was never about the actual money. It was never about the actual wealth. God, Jesus, was always wanting to shape our hearts because he knows that not only for Israel, but for us today, that no one just flips a switch to become a giver when you've been a slave for so many years without tremendous practice. To break the power of mammon by giving it away. Here's what Edmund Bauman says, who's an economist. He says this: money as a form of power is so intimately related to the possessor that one cannot consistently give money without giving of yourself. That is what God was always intending for Israel, shaping them in the way of generosity, his way to live out now an abundance mindset by giving themselves away, a piece of themselves, not only to God, but to one another and to the rest of creation, to learn, to trust God now, this good God who would care for them, instead of trusting themselves. But what about for us? I'm going to venture to say that we need much more than just practice. We need much more than just the law keeping us from stealing or commanding us to give. What we need, if we really want to give the way that Jesus intends us to give, is to first be a recipient of God's generosity in our own lives. Friends, that is the only way that we can actually become and have an abundance mindset. And of course, that is why Jesus himself is the true definition of radical generosity. Friends, do you know what it means to be generous? It comes from the word generate. The purpose of your generosity, the purpose of giving yourself away, is meant to bring about more and more life, to generate more life. And of course, we see that in what Jesus Christ has done for us. Friends, here's the thing. You and I, you realize that when we have this mentality of what's yours is mine, or even what's mine is mine, we realize that what we're ultimately doing is that we are stealing from God. We're taking his resources and doing with it what we think we should do. That's an act against God. That's a violation against him. And the insidious part, again, is that as we live into those ways, we think that's the way toward life. We think that's how we're going to get rich and have wealth, when that's actually leading us to death, to judgment. That's leading us into true spiritual poverty. And here's what Jesus does for us. In 2 Corinthians 8:9 says this: "For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for our sake, for your sake, he became poor, so that you, through his poverty, that you might now become rich." Do you realize what's happening on the cross? What Jesus has done to lavish you with his generous grace. He's paid the ultimate price for us, the death that we deserved, that he lets go of all the riches of heaven for all eternity, the perfect relationship with God the Father himself. He leaves that everything. He has everything in his hands, and he leaves that and lays that down and becomes rich, and becomes poor. He becomes born in a manger. He becomes nothing here in this world, someone who's despised in this land, and someone who bears the burden of all of the judgment of our world. He bears that so that now he might give you heavenly, eternal riches in him that will never fade, that will never rust, that will never get smaller, but will only grow as you trust him. He now gives you everything that was his, and he takes on everything that was yours. That's what's happening on the cross. We get the heavenly riches of Jesus in our lives as we trust him in the gospel. And do you know what that means for us practically then? That when you've received now Jesus' generosity and his grace in your life, that means that you are now free to give. That money is just money. Money is no longer your security or your comfort or your joy or your hope or your peace. And you can give of it because you now have every spiritual blessing in Christ. That you now have an inheritance in him that will never fade. The thing that you are desperate for, trying to protect, that's the thing that Jesus alone can give to you. And he says, once you get that deep into your bones, into your heart, then you will be free to give yourself away. And of course, in moments like this, everybody asks, well, how much? Some of us here, you probably just need to start by looking at how you spend your money and start practicing giving it away to others, for the sake of others, for the sake of God's kingdom. Give it away. But the answer that Jesus gives us by his example is that we are all now to give until it hurts, until we feel it. Because that means we are now truly giving a piece of ourselves away, a piece of our protection, our worth away. And ask God to meet you in that, to fill you with a trust in him, to learn what it's like to be completely covered by him, to have your joy fully from him. And if we give ourselves away like that, we will break the power of mammon in our lives. And we'll be able to generate more and more spiritual life and be more and more like Jesus, the one who loves us. Friends, I just want to say that you realize this group here, Redeemer Brooklyn, is the fruit of the generosity of other people outside of this room that have given sacrificially to see you all here finding life in Jesus. And that call is for us to now become a same kind of generous kind of people for the rest of Brooklyn. That's the vision that we have. To be about what he is doing. To give ourselves away. Let me just end with this final quote, this story from Eugene Peterson. This is one of my favorite stories by him. This is in his book called Running with the Horses, and he talks about how he's sitting in his house in Montana, and he looks out his window, and there's this awesome tree hanging over a cliff, and these baby birds were just born. And he says every morning he would wake up, get his coffee, and he would see mommy and daddy birds flying up and down, feeding these little baby chicks, until one day, the parent chicks start pecking and pushing these little baby chicks off this dead branch that's hanging off of a cliff. And starts pecking and pushing it further and further down until, and as they did, the claws of the young chicks just kept clinging on tighter and tighter to those dead branches because they're so afraid. Until finally, here's what Peterson says. The parent was without sentiment. He pecked at the desperately clinging talons until it was more painful for the poor chick to hang on than to risk the insecurities of flying. The grip was released and the inexperienced wings began pumping. The mature swallow knew what the chick did not, that it would fly, that there was no danger in making it do what it was perfectly designed to do. And then he goes on to say this, friends, we are given away. Our life is for others. That is the way creation works. That is God's way. He did it with his own son. Some of us are trying desperately to hold on to ourselves, to live for ourselves. And we look so bedraggled and pathetic doing it, hanging on to the dead branch of a bank account for dear life, afraid to risk ourselves on the untried wings of giving. We don't think that we can live generously because we have never tried. But the sooner we start, the better. For we are going to have to give up our lives finally. And the longer we wait, the less time we have for the soaring and the swooping life of grace.